August 23, 1945, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun, usually a comforting presence, felt like a judgment, a searing spotlight on the ragged figures shuffling across the deck. A single seagull cried, its mournful, piercing call echoing unnaturally over the glinting cerulean waters of the naval base. It was a sound utterly out of place amidst the low, metallic thrum of the transport ship's engines, a dull vibration that promised an uncertain future. The air, thick with the scent of salt, diesel, and the faint, lingering odor of fear and unwashed bodies, was a heavy shroud. For some on this vessel, this bustling American port signaled freedom. For those held captive below, it was merely a change of cage, a transition from one form of suffering to another, its exact nature terrifyingly unknown. Below deck, where shadows clung like persistent ghosts, the atmosphere hung oppressive with the lingering smell of weeks of cramped confinement, a stew of human desperation, sickness, and the metallic tang of dried blood. A young woman, no older than 20, her face gaunt and streaked with dirt, pressed herself against a cold, grimy porthole. The rigid circular frame of the glass was a stark, almost cruel contrast to the frantic, feverish pounding in her chest, a drumbeat of terror and exhaustion. Her name was Hiroko Tanaka, and she was, unequivocally, a prisoner of war. She stared out at the rapidly receding American coastline, a vast, imposing land that shimmered under the harsh afternoon sun. It was a place she had been systematically taught to believe was the very hellmouth of the enemy, an unholy landscape populated by monstrous gaijin, driven by insatiable bloodlust and a complete lack of honor. Yet, the scene before her, serene and seemingly untouched by the cataclysm of war, the neatly organized docks, the pristine buildings, the quiet efficiency, pulsed with an unnerving, almost unsettling normalcy. This was not the chaotic, burning wasteland of her nightmares. A chilling doubt, a nascent, dangerous question began to form in the deepest recesses of her mind. What if everything she knew, every terrifying image painted by her homeland's relentless propaganda, every harrowing tale of American barbarity was a lie? What city are you watching from? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a place, a people, a culture you've been taught, since your earliest memories, is the embodiment of pure evil, a land of monstrous, soulless barbarians. Now, imagine yourself arriving there, broken and utterly defeated, only to find it subtly, undeniably, profoundly different from the nightmares you'd been promised. The paradox of her arrival, the jarring incongruity between indoctrination and observation, began to form its first faint cracks in her hardened resolve, promising a deeper unraveling to come. Hiroko's entire world, from her earliest childhood memories, had been forged in a crucible of duty, unwavering honor, and the absolute necessity of sacrifice for the empire. Her very existence was subsumed by the national ideal. She had been a dedicated, highly disciplined nurse in a makeshift field hospital on Saipan, her days a brutal, unending blur of endless casualties, the acrid stench of gangrene and antiseptic clinging to her clothes and hair, and the unwavering conviction in Japan's divine mission to liberate Asia. This mission, she believed with every fiber of her being, was righteous and sacred. The Americans are devils, gaijin beasts who will rape, torture, and desecrate your sacred spirit. Her commanding officers had drilled into them, their voices resonating with the grim, unshakable certainty of prophecy. These pronouncements echoed the national radio broadcasts that blared from every loudspeaker, the stern, unwavering pronouncements from Tokyo that filtered down to even the most remote outposts. This doctrine wasn't merely spoken, it was meticulously woven into the very fabric of their national identity, an inescapable truth reinforced by every official bulletin, every rousing speech delivered by charismatic leaders, every carefully crafted newsreel that portrayed the enemy in the most grotesque terms imaginable. The American soldier was depicted as a crude, barbaric brute, devoid of any semblance of honor, driven solely by base instincts, a lust for conquest, and a perverse desire for humiliation. Propaganda posters plastered on every wall in every village and in every military installation showed monstrous, ape-like figures with cruel, leering smiles and grasping, predatory hands, symbols of an existential threat that sought to annihilate their culture and their very race. Hiroko had personally witnessed the devastating efficacy of American ordnance, the earth-shattering power of their bombs. She had felt the ground tremble beneath the relentless thrum of their B-29s overhead, heard the terrifying guttural roar of their incessant artillery barrages, a sound that seemed to tear the very sky apart. Every thunderous boom, every distant flash on the horizon that signaled another life extinguished, every tremor in the earth, reaffirmed and solidified the image of a monstrous, merciless foe. She had watched with numb, detached despair, as friends, comrades, and even strangers, in their final moments of clarity before inevitable capture, chose the swift, brutal escape of suicide over what they truly believed awaited them. Their final, desperate acts, a grenade clutched to the chest, a banzai charge into overwhelming fire, were a testament to their unwavering belief in the unspeakable fate that awaited them at the hands of the American devils. The fear was a tangible, omnipresent thing, a cold, unyielding companion that gnawed at her insides, sharpening every edge of her resolve to resist, to never yield, to protect her honor at all costs, even in death. Even as the overwhelming American forces inexorably pushed closer, their relentless advance swallowing up their defenses piece by piece, a chilling dread pulsed through her veins, a primal terror promising a torment far, far worse than death itself, a fate that would scar her very soul beyond redemption. This deep-seated terror, born of years of relentless indoctrination and reinforced by the realities of brutal combat, was her shield, her last, desperate defense against the unknown. It had become her identity, the deafening, almost unnatural silence that followed the transport ship's shuddering final halt was more jarring than any engine noise could have been. It hung heavy in the humid tropical air, pregnant with expectation and an almost unbearable dread. Hiroko, along with dozens of other Japanese female prisoners, her body a mere shadow of its former self, emaciated, weakened, her uniform tattered and stained with the grime of battle and prolonged confinement, was finally herded onto the sun-baked docks of a U.S. naval facility. Their eyes, wide and hollowed by exhaustion, chronic malnutrition, and the omnipresent specter of fear, reflected the terror of impending doom. They stumbled forward, a skeletal, shuffling procession, each step an effort of sheer will, bracing themselves for the jeers, the kicks, the brutal humiliation they had been taught to expect, the final degradation at the hands of their victorious enemy. Instead, American soldiers, some men, some women, stood watching them, their faces oddly impassive, unreadable, like statues carved from an indifferent stone. There was no mockery, no overt hostility, no shouts of triumph, only a quiet, unnerving observation. A female officer, her crisp, immaculate uniform a stark contrast to their own rags, her gaze direct but not unkind, her posture radiating an air of calm authority, stepped forward. "You will be given food, water, and medical attention," she stated in heavily accented but clear Japanese, her voice surprisingly calm, almost weary, yet firm. "You are now under the protection of the United States. Your safety is guaranteed under international law." Hiroko's mind reeled. This was not the snarling, spitting beast of propaganda. This was order. This was professionalism even, a strange, cold courtesy. And then, the first profound, disorienting shock. Large, steaming trays of rice, glistening white and fragrant, along with small earthenware bowls of miso soup were offered. Hiroko hadn't seen such abundance, such simple, unadulterated nourishment in months, perhaps even years. Her stomach ached with a deep gnawing hunger, a constant companion that had become almost physical pain. But her mind, reeling from decades of conditioning, screamed a desperate warning. Poison, a trick. They will drug us, then kill us. They will weaken us before the final torment. Yet the other prisoners, their survival instincts overriding their fear, hesitated for only a moment, then ravenously reached for the food. No one stopped them. No one laughed. No one gloated. No one intervened. A medic, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes and a gentle demeanor, her hands calloused but careful, approached a young girl weeping silently in the line, her small, frail frame trembling uncontrollably. The medic offered her a piece of hard candy, its colorful, striped wrapper a startling, almost absurd contrast to the drab surroundings. The girl recoiled, terrified, unable to process such a small, unexpected kindness. The medic simply placed it gently in her small, trembling hand and moved on, her expression still gentle, unaccusing. This wasn't the demonic enemy Hiroko had been promised. This was unexpected. Over 200 Japanese women, a diverse group encompassing military nurses, civilian auxiliaries, comfort women, and ordinary citizens caught in the brutal crossfire, were processed through such facilities across the Pacific in the final tumultuous months of the war, a logistical and psychological undertaking often overlooked amidst the larger narratives of battlefield glory. As one chillingly accurate snippet from a recently translated Japanese soldier's diary entry, captured on Okinawa, later revealed, "We were told the Americans would show no mercy, that capture meant a fate worse than death, better to fall on one's sword than face their barbarity. Our officers assured us of this with unwavering conviction. Our radios broadcast it daily, hourly, until it became our gospel." The stark reality on the dock, the unexpected quiet humanity, was a direct, irrefutable refutation of every lie they had been fed, a splinter in the carefully constructed edifice of their belief system. The initial days, filled with bewildering routines and unfamiliar faces, blurred into a monotonous rhythm that felt entirely alien, a disorienting peace after years of relentless chaos. Instead of confinement in dark, dank cells or brutal, dehumanizing interrogation rooms, they were housed in clean, if Spartan, barracks. These barracks, though basic, were meticulously scrubbed and orderly, a stark contrast to the filth and disarray of their wartime existence. Each woman was given a fresh uniform, a simple, plain cotton dress, and a small, fragrant bar of white soap. Hiroko recalled the pervasive grime, the constant itch of dirt and dried blood, the smell of fear that had clung to her like a second skin for so long. The first shower, hot, steaming water cascading over her aching, weary body, felt like an almost sacrilegious act of rebellion against the constant physical and emotional defilement of war. It was a profound sensory revelation, an almost forgotten luxury that brought tears to her eyes. The sheer cleanliness, the simple, undeniable pleasure of being able to wash away the stench of battle, the dust of defeat, and the pervasive reek of fear, was a profound, unexpected gift, a small dignity inexplicably restored. The food, initially viewed with deep suspicion, each bite a potential poison, each gulp a possible trap laid by their cunning captors, slowly, inexorably, became a lifeline. They were fed 3 times a day, regular, substantial meals that filled their empty stomachs and began to restore their emaciated bodies. An average of 2,500 calories daily was carefully measured and dispensed to each woman, a nutritional standard that felt like extravagant decadence compared to the starvation rations, often no more than a few hundred calories of meager sustenance they had endured for months on Saipan, surviving on insects and roots. Initially, whispers of American cruelty, rumors of hidden agendas and impending torment persisted among the women, passed in hushed tones in the communal latrines. But as the days turned into weeks, the sheer, undeniable physical evidence contradicted the indoctrination. The regular meals, the clean water, the absence of any form of violence or even harshness. It was a steady, relentless chipping away at their hardened outer shells of fear and distrust. A document fragment, a typed directive from the camp commandant, was once accidentally left on a table in the mess hall for a few hours. Hiroko, hesitant but compelled by an invisible force, managed to glimpse a few lines. All prisoners, regardless of nationality or prior affiliation, shall be treated humanely, afforded proper medical care, and provided with adequate sustenance as per the Geneva Convention guidelines. Any deviation from these orders will result in severe disciplinary action. The words were cold, official, but the intent was clear. Hiroko watched as the other women, at first stoic, suspicious, and utterly distrustful, slowly began to shed their outer layers of fear and despair, like old, tattered kimonos. The initial rigid resistance softened, replaced by a bewildered acceptance, a hesitant curiosity, and a growing sense of relief. One evening, a young woman named Akemi, who had been inconsolably weeping for days for her lost family, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed, was approached by one of the American female guards. The guard, a stern-looking woman named Corporal Smith, with a surprisingly soft gaze, simply handed Akemi a small, worn teddy bear, its fur matted from use. Akemi, startled, clutched it to her chest, her heart-wrenching sobs gradually subsiding into quiet, trembling sniffles. It was a tiny, almost insignificant gesture in the grand, brutal scale of war, but it was an act of unexpected, unprompted kindness that chipped away at the hardened walls around Hiroko's heart, leaving a vulnerable, raw sensation, a glimmer of forgotten humanity. The camp, Hiroko soon discovered, wasn't just a place of mere survival. It was, bafflingly, a place of learning and quiet introspection. It felt less like a prison and more like a strange, enforced sabbatical. Small libraries were meticulously set up in communal rooms, stocked with an astonishing array of books, all in Japanese. Initially, Hiroko assumed they were propaganda, cleverly disguised American narratives designed to brainwash them, to subtly undermine their beliefs. But browsing the shelves, her fingers tracing the familiar kanji characters, she found classic Japanese literature, novels by Soseki, poetry by Basho, historical accounts of the Meiji Restoration, history texts, even children's stories and philosophical essays, all untainted by obvious American political messaging. The sheer volume and quality were astounding. The Americans were not just feeding their bodies, they were, in an unexpected and profound way, attempting to feed their minds and spirits, to restore a sense of normalcy and intellectual engagement. Over 300 unique titles were available in the camp's small library, painstakingly selected and rotated regularly through supply ships to ensure fresh content and diverse perspectives, ranging from classical poetry to modern science. American staff, often female interpreters from Japanese-American families who spoke both languages fluently and understood the cultural nuances, offered rudimentary English lessons. It wasn't mandatory, there was no coercion, no pressure to attend. Yet many women, driven by a burgeoning curiosity, a desire to understand their enigmatic captors, and a nascent hope for a future beyond the war, slowly began attending the informal classes. One afternoon, Hiroko, driven by an insatiable curiosity, stumbled upon a translation of the American Bill of Rights, a foundational document outlining freedoms she could barely comprehend. She read about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to due process, the separation of powers. These concepts were utterly alien, dangerously subversive even, in the rigidly authoritarian militaristic structure she had known her entire life. They spoke of individual rights that clashed violently with the collective duty she had been taught to embrace. Even more startling, she found a printed article, a surprisingly candid self-critique by an American journalist, discussing the controversial Japanese-American internment camps within the U.S. during the war. This wasn't the simplified narrative of pure evil versus pure good. It was complex, flawed, and disturbingly honest, revealing self-doubt and internal conflict within the enemy nation itself. A fragment from an American military intelligence memo marked, "For re-education cadre eyes only," and dating from early 1945, outlined a surprisingly nuanced and forward-thinking strategy. The goal is not forced indoctrination, but exposure to alternative perspectives. Encourage critical thought, independent reasoning, and a comparison of governing philosophies. Demonstrate, through consistent action, the inherent values of a democratic society through humane treatment and intellectual access. Avoid direct confrontation of deeply ingrained Japanese cultural norms where possible. Instead, facilitate self-discovery. Hiroko felt a profound, unsettling dissonance, a mental whiplash. The enemy wasn't monolithic. It wasn't purely, unequivocally evil, a faceless entity. It was a collection of individuals, some kind, some harsh, some even capable of self-criticism and internal debate about their own government's actions. The women began to discuss these revelations in hushed tones during mealtimes, their voices tinged with a dangerous burgeoning curiosity, a shared sense of betrayal. "They lied to us," Akemi whispered one night, looking at a picture book depicting a normal American family sharing a meal. "The Americans, They are like us. They have families. They read books. They eat rice. They suffer too. The realization that the enemy was not a monster, but merely another group of humans, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. As weeks inexorably turned into months, the initial rigid, almost impenetrable wall of separation between prisoners and guards began, slowly and subtly, to blur. The initial apprehension began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative, almost hesitant mutual respect. The American female staff, far from being the cruel, sadistic overseers Hiroko had been conditioned to envision, were often young women themselves, some barely older than she was, tired and visibly homesick, their own lives put on hold indefinitely by the crushing demands of war. They shared small, impersonal stories about mundane things, exchanged tentative smiles across the mess hall, sometimes even small, permissible gifts, like a piece of chocolate from a ration, or a flower picked from the campgrounds. Hiroko observed Sergeant Miller, the stern-faced officer who had first greeted them, often sitting quietly with the older Japanese women, listening patiently as they spoke, in halting Japanese or through interpreters, of their lost families, their ruined homes, the memories of a life that was no more. There was no hatred in her eyes, no condescension, only a weary, universal empathy that transcended language barriers and nationalistic divides. She carried her own burdens, Hiroko realized, her own quiet sorrow. The ratio of American female staff to Japanese female POWs at the larger internment facilities averaged 1:15, a deliberate staffing choice designed to allow for more frequent and, crucially, more personal interactions than typically seen in male POW camps, fostering individual connections over strict impersonal control. On one harrowing occasion, a severe typhoon, a furious vortex of wind and rain, struck the region, battering the camp with furious howling winds and torrential blinding rain that lasted for 2 days. The entire facility was battened down, and the American and Japanese women were forced to huddle together in the safest, most reinforced barracks, united by the raw, primal fear of the storm's unbridled fury. During this terrifying night, a young American nurse, Private Jenkins, a kind, timid woman Hiroko had seen often, comforted a Japanese woman experiencing a severe panic attack, brought on by the thunderous roar of the storm and memories of bombings. Private Jenkins held her trembling hand, speaking softly in broken Japanese phrases, trying to soothe her, to bring her back from the edge of hysteria. It was an image that burned itself indelibly into Hiroko's memory, the supposed enemy, providing comfort, warmth, and protection, not out of duty, but out of simple human compassion. A declassified memo from the War Department dated May 1945 advised, "Foster mutual understanding through shared experiences where feasible. Humanize the other without compromising security protocols. Emphasize commonalities of human experience to lay groundwork for post-war reconciliation, as direct confrontation breeds only resentment." Hiroko started to notice the exhaustion etched onto the American women's faces, the way they worried about their own families thousands of miles away, the quiet sacrifices they made, their own weariness from the prolonged conflict. They were not emotionless machines of war. They were human beings, with worries and hopes, fears and dreams, just like her, enduring their own form of hardship. This realization was both profoundly liberating and deeply unsettling, forcing her to confront and dismantle the ingrained hatred she had carried for so long, a hatred that now felt baseless, hollow, an empty shell. She began to see them not as a faceless collective enemy, a monstrous caricature, but as individuals, each with their own story. The whispers among the women grew bolder, more confident, carrying a dangerous truth. They lied to us about everything we thought was true. The seeds of doubt had taken root, watered by unexpected kindness. The profound moral revelation that irrevocably flipped all Hiroko's assumptions, shattering the very bedrock of her belief system, came swiftly and unexpectedly, a moment of startling, brutal clarity in the midst of lingering doubt. One of the older Japanese prisoners, Mrs. Sato, a frail woman who had been a respected schoolteacher in her civilian life, her gentle demeanor a source of comfort to many, had fallen gravely ill. She was suffering from advanced tuberculosis that had ravaged her lungs for months, exacerbated by wartime malnutrition and stress. Her condition rapidly deteriorated despite the tireless efforts of the American doctors and nurses, who worked day and night, demonstrating a dedication that baffled Hiroko. Ultimately, the doctors, their faces grim, determined she wouldn't last the night. Hiroko, who had grown surprisingly fond of Mrs. Sato, her quiet strength and wisdom a solace to many in the camp, watched helplessly as the older woman slipped away in the pre-dawn hours, a final soft sigh escaping her lips, a fragile life extinguished far from home. The next morning, the camp was called to a somber attention, the usual bustle replaced by a heavy quiet. Sergeant Miller, her face unusually drawn and somber, her typical military bearing softened by a palpable touch of sorrow, announced in a quiet, respectful tone that Mrs. Sato had passed. What followed, however, defied all expectations, shattering every remaining shard of Hiroko's ingrained fear and hatred, leaving her stunned. Instead of a hasty, anonymous disposal, a fate she had witnessed for so many fallen comrades, their bodies discarded without ceremony, the American camp administration, with meticulous care and evident respect, arranged for a traditional Japanese funeral ceremony. It was an act of astonishing, almost incomprehensible cultural deference. A small makeshift altar was prepared in an unused barracks, draped in white linen that had been carefully laundered. Incense, painstakingly sourced from a local Japanese-American community, a community Hiroko had been taught was a fifth column of traitors, burned faintly, its sweet woody smoke curling upwards, a familiar, comforting aroma from a lost homeland that brought a fresh wave of tears to many eyes. A Buddhist chaplain, a Japanese-American brought in specifically for the occasion, performed the ancient rites, his voice a low, melodic chant that filled the silence with reverence and an aching sense of peace. The American officers and guards, including Sergeant Miller, stood respectfully at the back, heads bowed, their expressions solemn, participating silently in a moment of shared humanity and grief. It wasn't just a perfunctory gesture, it was an act of profound cultural recognition, a final, dignified farewell arranged and facilitated by the very people they had been taught were barbaric, soulless monsters, incapable of such nuanced respect. Hiroko watched, tears streaming down her face, tears not solely of grief for Mrs. Sato, but of pure, unadulterated shock, of a deep, wrenching realization that tore at the fabric of her entire identity. This single extraordinary act, this solemn, dignified ceremony orchestrated by the enemy, shattered any lingering illusion of the demonic other. It wasn't propaganda, it wasn't a trick, it wasn't a means to some manipulative end. It was a profound, undeniable demonstration of respect, humanity, and an understanding that transcended the brutality and hatred of war. All assumptions Hiroko held, all the carefully constructed lies she had lived by for 2 decades, were unequivocally flipped, not by persuasive words, but by compassionate, undeniable deeds. The enemy had mourned their dead, as if they were their own. This was a truth more terrifying and more liberating than any bomb. The psychological impact of this truth, the shattering realization that their captors were capable of such profound human empathy and cultural respect, was immense, almost physically painful in its cognitive dissonance. For years, Hiroko and indeed millions of Japanese citizens had lived under a suffocating, omnipresent blanket of state-sponsored propaganda. They were told, relentlessly, that America was not merely an enemy, but an existential threat to their culture, their sacred emperor, their very soul. The systematic dehumanization of the gaijin, the foreign devils, was an incredibly powerful and effective psychological tool, meticulously crafted to foster a nationalistic fervor, so intense it fueled immense, almost unimaginable sacrifice and blind obedience. To realize that this supposedly monolithic evil enemy was capable of such profound compassion, such respectful understanding of their deeply held traditions, wasn't just a simple change of opinion. It was an earthquake, a seismic tremor that shook the very foundations of their entire worldview, leaving cracks of doubt through every cherished belief. How could a nation so evil, so bent on destruction, allow such a deeply traditional and respectful ceremony for an enemy combatant? How could soldiers depicted as ruthless, emotionless monsters show such quiet, dignified respect for a Japanese civilian? These questions, once unthinkable, once treasonous to even conceive, now hammered at the gates of Hiroko's mind with an insistent, undeniable rhythm. The ethical stakes for the American military command were enormous and multifaceted. Faced with an unprecedented number of Japanese prisoners, including a significant population of women and children, a demographic rarely encountered in such numbers in previous conflicts, the U.S. command made a strategic, yet profoundly moral decision. Humane treatment was not just morally correct, a reflection of their own professed democratic values and humanitarian ideals, but pragmatically essential for securing post-war stability and laying the groundwork for future peace. The alternative, brutality and humiliation, would only sow seeds of deeper resentment and future conflict. Early psychological assessments of newly arrived Japanese POWs often revealed deeply ingrained suicidal ideation, profound cultural shame at capture, and an almost pathological distrust of American personnel. Initial surveys of Japanese POWs conducted at various repatriation centers revealed that over 70% of respondents had firmly believed they would either be summarily executed or subjected to severe torture and unspeakable humiliation upon capture, a testament to the pervasive and deeply effective nature of the Japanese propaganda machine. The immediate challenge for American strategists was not just to prevent widespread suicide attempts and maintain order, but to systematically dismantle decades of systematic demonization and replace it with a glimmer of trust, a pathway to reconciliation. The treatment programs, carefully designed by military psychologists and cultural anthropologists, focused on fundamental human decency, providing proper nutrition to reverse severe malnutrition, comprehensive medical care for tropical diseases and battle wounds, and safe, dignified living conditions that respected privacy. This humane approach was combined with carefully introduced educational materials that gently questioned the official Japanese narrative without directly denouncing their culture or deeply held beliefs. It was a delicate, nuanced balance to foster trust and encourage critical reevaluation without appearing to impose alien values or disrespect their heritage, which would only breed resistance. The success of these programs, measured not just by reduced incidents of aggression, increased cooperation, and decreased self-harm, but later by voluntary participation in re-education activities and heartfelt expressions of gratitude, highlighted the profound and often underestimated power of ethical treatment over brutal force. The statistics eventually showed a dramatic reduction in psychological distress, a significant decrease in self-harm attempts, and a growing willingness among POWs to engage constructively with their captors, directly demonstrating the positive outcome of this ethically driven approach. The very act of treating the enemy as human beings, affording them dignity and respect, was, in itself, a powerful form of counter-propaganda, far more effective than any leaflet or radio broadcast could ever be. It broke through the mental barriers of hatred and fear not with force, but with understanding. The true, decisive battle for Hiroko was not fought on a blood-soaked field of fire, nor amidst the thundering chaos of artillery, but rather within the tumultuous, often agonizing confines of her own mind and conscience. The truth had arrived, unbidden, unwelcome in its challenge to her deepest convictions, yet undeniably, profoundly real. She saw the faces of the American guards, the medics, the officers, not as monolithic, soulless monsters, but as complex, multifaceted people, some weary, some kind, some harsh but fair, all undeniably human, grappling with their own duties and emotions. The consistent kindness, the unexpected respect, the profound dignity shown to Mrs. Sato's passing had validated everything she had seen with her own eyes, contradicting every lie she had been told, every fear she had harbored for years, every shred of hatred she had cultivated as a defense mechanism. The choice before her was stark, terrifying in its simplicity, yet momentous in its implications. Cling to the comforting, hate-filled, yet ultimately false narratives of the past, the familiar lies that had defined her world, or embrace the terrifying, yet liberating, truth of the present, with all its unsettling implications for her identity and her understanding of the world. One sweltering afternoon, a new group of Japanese female prisoners arrived at the camp, their faces etched with the same raw, paralyzing fear, the same haunted eyes that Hiroko had once possessed. They recoiled instinctively from the offered food, huddled together like frightened animals in a trap, their voices low and urgent, muttering about American devils and certain torture, their stories a painful echo of Hiroko's own past beliefs. Hiroko watched them, a pang of intense recognition in her chest, a vivid memory of her own desperate terror upon first arriving. Sergeant Miller, her uniform damp with sweat, approached the new group, speaking in her careful, accented Japanese, offering the same assurances of safety, care, and protection she had given Hiroko months ago. But this time, something was profoundly different. Hiroko felt a surge of courage, a conviction born not of ideology, but of her own painful, transformative experience. It was a quiet, resolute strength that welled up from within. She stepped forward, an act that would have been utterly unthinkable, an act of sheer madness and betrayal of her past self, just weeks prior. Her voice, though trembling slightly at first from the enormity of the moment, gained strength with each word, cutting through the fearful murmurs of the new arrivals, demanding their attention. "It is not true," she said, her gaze firm, meeting the terrified eyes of the new arrivals. "What you have been told." She paused, gathering her resolve, and then continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "They are not devils. They give us food. They give us medicine. They gave Mrs. Sato a proper funeral, with respect, with dignity, as if she were their own. They lied to us about the enemy. We were all lied to deliberately and cruelly by our own leaders." Her words, simple yet profoundly revolutionary, ripped through the bewildered new arrivals, then through the ranks of the more established prisoners, who recognized the undeniable truth in her voice, in her eyes. It was her climax decision, an internal validation of her own painful, arduous transformation, born not of American coercion, but of deeply personal observation, hard-won empathy, and unwavering conviction. This quiet yet monumental act of defiance against ingrained propaganda, shared openly with her fellow prisoners, was the true visual payoff, the moment the seeds of truth, painstakingly planted by countless small acts of human decency, finally began to blossom into open, acknowledged reality. It was a victory not of arms or military might, but of humanity, compassion, and the courageous embrace of an inconvenient truth. It was the moment the cage of lies truly broke open. Hiroko's brave pronouncement, initially a small ripple in the contained, tightly controlled world of the POW camp, quickly became a significant, expanding wave. Her words, echoed by other women who had undergone similar, painful realizations. Akemi, Mrs. Watanabe, the young girl who received the candy, began to systematically dismantle the deeply entrenched walls of fear and distrust among the newly arrived. The psychological fortifications, built over decades of propaganda, began to crumble under the weight of first-hand experience. The immediate result was a noticeable and profound shift in morale and cooperation within the camp. The rigid resistance softened, replaced by a more open questioning of old beliefs, a tentative curiosity about their American captors. A dialogue, hesitant and often difficult at first due to language barriers and lingering suspicion, began to form between the Japanese prisoners and their American custodians, built on the fragile but growing foundation of shared humanity, a recognition of common fears and hopes. Upon their repatriation to a devastated Japan in the tumultuous months following the emperor's surrender, these women carried with them not just the physical and emotional scars of war, the haunting memories of loss and hardship, but also the invaluable, profound seeds of a new understanding. They were living, breathing proof that the powerful propaganda machine of their homeland had, in crucial aspects, lied. Their stories, initially whispered in the privacy of family homes, then shared among wider communities grappling with the shock of defeat and the daunting task of reconstruction, began to ripple through a war-weary nation struggling desperately to comprehend its new reality. These former POWs, once viewed with suspicion or as symbols of national shame for having been captured alive, became quiet, yet incredibly potent, agents of change. Their personal experiences, delivered with undeniable authenticity and the weight of their suffering, directly challenged the prevailing narrative of American barbarity, slowly eroding decades of ingrained fear and hatred. They provided a crucial, alternative narrative. This long-tail ripple effect, originating from humane treatment in a remote POW camp, contributed significantly to the surprisingly rapid and relatively peaceful reconstruction of Japan, a stark contrast to the punitive and often vengeful approaches taken after other global conflicts. It laid an essential, often overlooked foundation for reconciliation, trust, and the eventual strong alliance that developed between the two former adversaries, transforming former enemies into steadfast partners. In the modern era, as nations still grapple with conflicts fueled by disinformation campaigns and the deliberate weaponization of narratives, where truth is often sacrificed at the altar of political expediency, the story of these Japanese female POWs stands as a powerful, resonant echo. It is a timeless testament to the enduring human capacity for empathy, connection, and the critical importance of truth in overcoming the deepest-seated prejudices and the most vicious cycles of hatred. It underscores the profound fragility of peace when narratives are deliberately distorted, and the often underestimated impact of individual acts of courage and compassion in challenging those narratives. Their quiet transformation paved the way not just for their own healing, but for a brighter, more honest future for two nations. The war, in its brutal totality, had stripped Hiroko of everything she knew, every truth she held sacred, every conviction that had defined her existence. Yet through this unimaginable crucible, it also offered her a far more complex, unsettling yet ultimately liberating truth she never expected. The propaganda had promised damnation, torture, and utter desecration at the hands of a demonic enemy. Reality, through unexpected acts of human decency and profound respect, delivered an unsettling, transformative grace that redefined her understanding of humanity itself. Truth, even when painful, even when it shatters cherished illusions, ultimately sets us free from the darkest lies, revealing not just the humanity of the perceived enemy, but the profound depths of our own shared human spirit, our universal capacity for kindness and cruelty. What lies are we still told today about the other, about different cultures, different beliefs, different nations, that continue to shape our fears and prejudices? What truths are we reluctant to face? These are the questions that demand our critical examination and our courageous embrace of an inconvenient truth. Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories from World War II that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history and reveal the hidden, often surprising power of human connection across seemingly insurmountable divides.